My son's wedding was the most beautiful room I had ever been invisible in. The venue was everything Deshawn had wanted: high ceilings, soft gold lighting, round tables dressed in white linen, a bar that never ran dry. Charlotte's finest had shown up in their best. Laughter moved through the room in warm, easy waves. The band played something smooth and unhurried. Everyone looked like they belonged exactly where they were standing. I was standing alone near the far window with a glass of water I hadn't touched, watching my son's work the room the way he had been working rooms since he was 22. Chin up, hand extended, smile arriving just before the words. Deshawn had always known how to make an entrance feel like a gift to whoever received it. I had always known that the gift had conditions. My name is Verlaine Odom. I am 58 years old. I raised that man. And on the evening of his wedding, I was the one thing in that room he needed to manage. I felt him before I saw him. The hand at my back, not a guide, a grip. The specific pressure of a man moving something he finds inconvenient without wanting to appear as though he is moving it at all. I set my glass down on the windowsill and let him steer me. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, low and smooth. Nothing in his voice suggested what was coming. He walked me across the room toward a man holding court near the center. Tall, silver at the temples, the kind of stillness around him that only comes from decades of being the most significant person present. 3 associates flanked him in a loose half-circle. Reginald Whitfield, my new daughter-in-law's father, a name that moved markets in 3 states. Deshawn's hand stayed at back until we were close enough that removing it would have looked deliberate. Then he began, "Mr. Whitfield, this is my mother. I should warn you." A small laugh, rehearsed, landing like a joke told too many times. "She's what we call the family failure. Never quite figured out what she wanted to do with herself." I kept my face still. Cortland materialized at my left shoulder the way he always did, drawn to Deshawn's orbit like something without its own gravity. He half-turned toward the bar as he spoke, his attention already leaving before his words arrived. "We don't brag about her," he said, casual, unexamined, gone before the sentence finished. "If you are watching this right now, drop the time in the comments. I want to know what hour found you here, because what happened next changed everything." Reginald Whitfield did not laugh. That was the first change in the room. His glass paused halfway to his mouth, not dramatically, just long enough for his eyes to settle on me properly now, with the specific attention of a man rechecking information he thought he understood. One of the associates beside him glanced between us. The conversation nearest to us softened slightly, more instinct than interruption. Then Reginald set his glass down. He stepped forward and took my hand in both of his. Not performative warmth, not society politeness. Recognition, real recognition. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only I could hear the full weight of it. "So it's you." A pause. "This is unexpected." Behind me, Deshawn gave a short, uncertain laugh, the kind people use when they feel a conversation shifting somewhere they can no longer predict. Cortland turned more fully toward the bar, already reaching for the safety of another interaction. Neither of them saw what I saw. Reginald Whitfield was not looking at me like a billionaire discovering hidden royalty. He was looking at me the way experienced people look when a professional name they have heard quietly for years suddenly acquires a face. Mine, here, in this room, being introduced as though I were a cautionary tale instead of a person. There was no spectacle in his reaction. That was what made it matter. He leaned slightly closer, said 4 words I will not repeat yet. I simply nodded. Deshawn's face was doing something it had never done in front of me before. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something quieter and more unsettling than either. The specific expression of a man who has handed something over confidently and is only now realizing he did not understand what he was holding. He stood 8 feet away with his champagne glass and his wedding smile, and watched Reginald Whitfield keep me exactly where I was, and I could see him searching for an explanation that fit the world as he had built it. He did not find one. Reginald moved naturally, the way men of his standing always move in rooms, without urgency, without performance. He turned slightly to his left and introduced me to the 2 associates still flanking him. First name only, no title offered, no context given. Just, "This is Verlaine," the way you introduce someone whose name is expected to do its own work. It did. The first associate, A compact man in a charcoal suit extended his hand and said, "I didn't realize." That was all. 3 words carrying the specific weight of someone recalibrating a room they thought they already understood. The second associate, a woman with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, held my hand a half-second longer than a standard greeting requires. "Odom Capital," she said quietly. Not a question. I smiled and said it was good to meet them both. Across the room, Deshawn had not moved. Cortland found me within minutes. He came close enough that his voice wouldn't carry and tilted his head toward Reginald with the expression he always used when he wanted to appear casual about something that was eating at him. "How do you know that man?" he asked. I looked at him, let the question sit for exactly 1 beat. Then I smiled. The same smile I had been giving Cortland for 32 years when I had decided a conversation was not worth having, and said, "We've crossed paths." He waited for more. I picked up a fresh glass from a passing tray and turned slightly toward the room. That was the end of that. What I noticed next was Amara. She had positioned herself near her father with the practiced ease of always some time reading him, close enough to observe, far enough not to intrude. She was studying his face the way you study something that is behaving outside its pattern. Reginald Whitfield had attended dinners with senators, closed rooms with developers worth 9 figures, and stood in circles that move serious money. Amara had watched all of it. She knew exactly how her father looked in those rooms. He had never looked at anyone the way he had just looked at me. I watched her watching him, and I remembered something. 3 weeks before this wedding, at a dinner in Deshawn's home, someone had directed a question toward me about my background. Amara had answered before I finished my first sentence. Smooth, warm, seamless, and steered the table somewhere else entirely. She had not been cruel about it. She had simply decided in that moment that my answer was not necessary. I had filed it then. I filed this moment now. Same drawer, no urgency. The band shifted into something slower. Conversations resumed their natural shape around us. The room settled back into its version of normal. It was not the same room it had been 40 minutes ago. Only 2 people in it understood that fully. Reginald caught my eye from across the space, a single glance, unhurried and deliberate, and nodded once. The specific nod of a man confirming something that did not need to be spoken aloud. I nodded back. Deshawn saw it. I know because I saw him see it. The stillness that moved through his body like something cold finding no exit. He did not know what had just passed between us. He knew it mattered. Reginald Whitfield did not summon me. He simply began moving toward the quieter end of the room and left just enough space beside him that the invitation was clear without being stated. That was the language of a man who had never needed to ask twice for anything. I followed. We settled near a stretch of wall away from the band, away from the bar, away from the warm cluster of wedding noise. He turned toward me with the full attention of someone who had been waiting to have this conversation for longer than I had known. It was coming. "Your attorney is Prentice Ware," he said. Not a question. "Has been for 22 years, I said. He nodded once, the way men nod when a detail confirms something they already suspected. 8 years ago, my team was working a Southeast Corridor acquisition, he said. Different asset class, different market position, but the same structural fingerprint as a repositioning that had moved through Charlotte a few years earlier. My attorney flagged it, said the prior move was cleaner than anything he'd seen in that space. He paused briefly. He reached out to Prentice's office for background. She said the principal preferred to remain private. My team respected that. A faint shift at the corner of his mouth. I remembered the name anyway. Odom Capital, I said. Odom Capital, he repeated. And then tonight your son introduced you, and you said your last name and. He stopped. A short exhale through the nose. Almost a laugh, but quieter than that. That was all it took. I had said my name the way I always said it, plainly, without decoration. I had not known that one word had been sitting in Reginald Whitfield's professional memory for 8 years waiting for a face. The Charlotte repositioning saved that project, he said. I don't use that word loosely. Half the room thought the corridor had peaked already. You moved before the institutional money caught up. He looked at me directly. That changed the outcome for everyone downstream from it. It was a calculated decision, I said. The fundamentals supported it. They did, he agreed. But plenty of people see fundamentals and still hesitate. Timing is usually where people fail. There was no performance in the conversation, no showing off, no need to establish credentials either of us already understood. We spoke in the natural shorthand of people who had spent years reading the same landscape from different corners of it. It was the most honest conversation I had been part of in years. No translation, no softening, no careful editing of myself before the words left my mouth. I had forgotten what that felt like. I became aware of Deshaun before he spoke. He had positioned himself close enough to hear fragments and far enough away to pretend he wasn't listening. What he was hearing was making no sense to him. I could feel it in the way he kept shifting his weight, recalibrating, trying to find an angle that made this version of his mother fit the one he had carried his entire adult life. It did not fit. It was never going to fit. He stepped forward finally and touched Reginald's arm lightly, the social interruption dressed as familiarity. "Mr. Whitfield, I hope she's not talking your ear off." A laugh followed it. Rehearsed. Landing badly. Not cruel enough to challenge directly. Just dismissive enough to shrink the moment back into proportions he understood. Reginald turned slowly toward him. The expression on his face was not unkind. That would have been easier for Deshaun to process. It was something more unsettling than unkind. Patient, measured, completely without social cushioning. The look of a man quietly reassessing another man in real time. For a brief second, nobody spoke. Then Reginald said, very evenly, "Your mother and I were discussing a project that impacted half this corridor." Nothing aggressive in the sentence. That was what made it land. Deshaun's smile faltered almost invisibly at the edges. He glanced at me then, quickly, instinctively, like he was checking whether I intended to rescue him from the moment or expose him further inside it. I did neither. Reginald returned his attention to me with calm finality, and Deshaun's laugh disappeared before it fully finished. Amara Whitfield Odom had been watching her father since she was 4 years old. I knew this the way you know things about people who have never spoken them to you. Through observation, through pattern, through the specific quality of attention a daughter gives a father she has spent her whole life studying. She knew every register of Reginald Whitfield. She knew what his face did when he was being polite to someone unimportant. She knew what his posture did when he was genuinely engaged. She had been reading him across rooms since before she understood what reading a room meant. Which is why, when she found him between conversations near the back of the venue, she was not asking casually. I was 20 feet away with a clear sightline and nothing to do but watch. I could not hear them. I did not need to. Amara asked something direct. Her chin level, her hands still, the body language of a woman who wanted a real answer and intended to know whether she was receiving one. Reginald listened to the full question before he responded. He answered carefully, measured words, deliberate pacing, the specific delivery of a man who was not lying, but was not volunteering everything either. He was handing his daughter the tools and letting her build her own conclusion. She was her father's daughter. She would build it correctly. She returned to Deshaun's side 3 minutes later. To anyone else in that room, she looked exactly the same. Composed, beautiful, the bride at her own reception, moving through the evening with ease. But I had been watching her before she went to her father, and I was watching her now. Her posture had changed by 3 degrees. Something behind her eyes had quietly rearranged itself. Deshaun did not notice. He was already mid-story with 2 friends from his professional circle. One hand gesturing, the other holding his glass at the angle he's always held it when he was performing comfort. I watched him reach the part of whatever story he was telling that required a light reference to me. I knew the shape of it before the words arrived, had heard its variations for years, and deliver it with the easy confidence of a man who had never once been challenged on that particular material. His friends laughed. Amara picked up her glass and looked at the table, not at him. Not at his friends, at the table, the white linen, centerpiece, somewhere that was not the source of the laughter. That was the first time she didn't follow him. Small, quiet. Most people in that room would have missed it entirely. But I have been reading Small and Quiet my entire life. Small and quiet is where everything that matters begins. She had not turned, not yet. But she had stopped moving in the direction she came in. And in my experience, when a woman of her particular intelligence stops moving in one direction, she is already choosing another. The evening wound toward its close. The band softened, guests began the slow drift toward exits. Reginald found me one final time near the entrance hall, unhurried, deliberate, as though he had been saving this moment. "I'd like to send something to your office next week," he said. "If that's agreeable." "That's fine," I said. Neither of us explained what that meant. Neither of us needed to. His associate, the woman with the reading glasses from earlier, approached, and I gave her my professional contact. Not my home number, my office line, the one that rang at Prentice Ware's suite on Tryon Street. I felt Deshawn watching from across the room. I did not look up. What was tightening in his chest at that moment was his own business. I had spent enough years managing his comfort. Tonight that work was finished. 3 weeks after the wedding, Deshawn hosted dinner. That was how I knew he was unsettled. Deshawn did not host family dinners out of warmth. He hosted them out of strategy. When something in his world shifted outside his control, he pulled people back into a room he owned and reset the order of things from the head of his own table. I had watched him do this since he was 26 years old. I recognized the move the moment the invitation came. I came anyway. I always came. His home was handsome. Good furniture, good lighting, the kind of deliberate, tasteful arrangement that announced ambition without quite achieving ease. Amara had set the table herself. She greeted me at the door with both hands and held the contact a half-second longer than she used to. I noted it, said nothing. The guest Deshawn had invited was a man named Gerald Fitch, commercial real estate broker, Southeast Corridor, 15 years in the market. Deshawn introduced him, with the specific energy of someone displaying a new connection, the Whitfield name already doing its work in the introduction. Gerald Fitch had the handshake of a man who understood that tonight's dinner was partly social and partly evaluation. The meal moved the way those meals always move. Careful conversation, probing questions dressed as small talk, everyone performing a version of themselves, slightly more polished than the one they arrived with. Cortland talked about his years in corporate. Deshawn talked about his current projects. Gerald Fitch listened well and chose his moments. His moment came over the main course. He was discussing the Southeast Corridor, the market shifts, the developments that had shaped parts of its trajectory over the last decade. When he mentioned the Charlotte repositioning, not dramatically, the way professionals reference deals that quietly changed how people in their field thought afterward. He named the development, described the point where financing tightened and several firms backed away, described the repositioning structure that stabilized it before the wider market fully understood where the corridors was heading. He shook his head once. "That was one of those deals people still bring up in investment conversations," he said. "Not publicly. Most people outside commercial real estate wouldn't know it. But in the market, people remember who moved early." Cortland leaned forward slightly. "Who was behind it?" Gerald Fitch cut into his food before answering. "Private investment group. Odom Capital." The words landed lightly from his mouth and heavily everywhere else. He continued without noticing immediately what had happened at the table. "They kept a low profile. Didn't chase publicity. That's part of why people respected the move so much. No interviews. No conferences. Just good positioning and good timing." The table went quiet. Not the quiet of an empty moment. The quiet of a specific weight, settling over specific people who were each processing the same two words at different speeds. I reached for the breadbasket, passed it to Amara, kept my eyes on my plate. Gerald Fitch looked between us then, finally sensing the shift. Deshawn picked up his wine glass too quickly. "You've mentioned them before," he said casually, aiming for relaxed and landing somewhere noticeably tighter. Gerald nodded. "Anybody who spent enough time around Southeast commercial development has heard the name at some point, mostly through attorneys, lenders, acquisition circles." He shrugged lightly. Nobody really knew much about who was behind it. Cortland looked at me. I met his eyes for exactly 1 second. No expression offered, nothing confirmed, nothing denied, and returned to my plate. The name was already in the room. It did not need my help to land. The dinner ended 40 minutes later. No one proposed dessert. No one suggested coffee. Deshawn walked Gerald Fitch to the door with the slightly flattened energy of a man whose evening had not gone the direction he intended. Amara cleared the table in silence. Cortland drove us home without speaking. The house was dark when we arrived. I went upstairs, changed, got into bed. 2 hours later, I came down for water. He was at the kitchen table, both hands flat on the surface. the same untouched glass from before dinner still in front of him. He looked up when I came in and opened his mouth. I looked at him gently. "Get some rest, Cortland." I went back upstairs. He was still at the table when I reached the top of the stairs. I could feel it without looking. Reginald Whitfield hosted the way he did everything else, without waste. His home was substantial without being excessive. The kind of space that announced its owner had nothing left to prove. 40 guests, maybe 45. The professional community that moved in his orbit. Developers, attorneys, fund managers, people whose names appeared on buildings and legal structures rather than social pages. The kind of room where conversations meant something, because everyone in it understood the cost of words that didn't. I had been in rooms like this before, not as a guest of Reginald Whitfield, as myself. That distinction mattered tonight. Within 20 minutes of arriving, I had been pulled into 3 separate conversations that had nothing to do with introductions and everything to do with recognition. Not celebrity recognition, professional memory. A developer from Huntsville mentioned a secondary market repositioning from 11 years earlier and asked whether I still believed smaller corridor acquisitions were being undervalued in the current market. A woman who managed a regional fund referenced Prentice Ware in the shorthand of someone who had crossed paths with her firm repeatedly over the years. Another man, older, careful with his words, listened to me speak for less than 2 minutes before saying quietly, "Odom Capital. I thought that might be you." No one made a spectacle of it. That was what made it real. Rooms like this did not gasp. They recalibrated quietly. I received each conversation the way I received all accurate things. Directly, without performance. Deshawn stood 12 feet away and watched all of it. I did not look at him. I did not need to. I could feel the specific quality of his stillness from across the room. The stillness of a man realizing the room was responding to his mother before it was responding to him. That was new for him. Reginald found Deshawn near the bar midway through the evening. I observed it from a distance. A brief exchange. Reginald's posture open and cordial. Nothing in his body language that would signal to anyone watching that this was anything other than a father-in-law making conversation with his daughter's new husband. He asked Deshawn something. Deshawn answered. Reginald nodded once and asked another question, slower this time, something longer. Deshawn responded with the slightly elevated energy of a man trying to sound more informed than he actually felt. Reginald listened completely, not interrupting, not correcting. Then he asked one final thing. I saw Deshawn hesitate before answering that one, only for a second. Most people would have missed it. Reginald did not miss it. He gave that same deliberate nod I had already learned, meant confirmation rather than discovery. Then he said something brief, touched Deshawn lightly on the shoulder, and moved back into the room. Deshawn remained at the bar alone for several seconds longer than was natural, not embarrassed. Disoriented, that was the word for it. For the first time in his adult life, he had entered a room where his understanding of status did not fully apply. The hierarchy he had built his confidence around was shifting beneath him in real time, and he did not yet know where to stand inside it. He found me before the evening ended. His approach was different from every approach he had made toward me in his adult life. Less momentum, more caution. The way you approach something you have recently learned may contain more history than you were given. What do you and Reginald talk about at these things? He asked. Work, I said. He waited. I let him wait. Nothing else came because nothing else was necessary. His jaw moved slightly. He nodded in the way people nod when they are accepting an answer they do not know how to challenge. Then he asked something he had never asked me before. How long have people known your company name? Not accusatory, not even defensive anymore. Just trying to understand the size of the room he had walked into without realizing it. A long time, I said. That answer unsettled him more than anything else I could have offered. He and Amara left 40 minutes later. I watched them from near the entrance as they said their goodbyes. Deshawn's hand at Amara's back, the same practice placement he had used to steer me across the wedding reception 6 weeks ago. She moved with it, but her eyes were elsewhere. I learned what happened in the car 3 days later from Amara herself. Deshawn had said her father seemed unusually interested in his mother. Amara had looked out the passenger window for a long moment before she answered. Maybe he just recognizes quality. Deshawn had said nothing for the rest of the drive. The car had been very quiet. He rang the bell instead of using his key. That was the first thing I noticed. Deshaun had a key to my house, had carried one since he moved out at 23. He had never once rung the bell. He rang it that Tuesday morning, the way a man rings a bell when he is no longer certain of his standing in a place he once took for granted. I opened the door, said nothing, stepped back to let him in. He sat at the kitchen table without being invited to, the habit of a lifetime overriding whatever carefulness he had arrived with. I put coffee on because it gave my hands something to do. That wasn't watching him arrange his face into the expression he wanted me to see. He started the way people start, when they have rehearsed casualness all the way to the door and are now discovering it sounds different out loud. "How long have you known Reginald Whitfield?" he asked. "I mean, before the wedding." "I didn't know him personally before the wedding," I said. "I knew of him. He knew of some of my work." "Through what?" "Through the work itself." I set his coffee in front of him. "That's how professional reputations move, Deshaun. Quietly. Mostly through people already in the same rooms." He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it. "What exactly did you do?" he asked. "Before you retired." "I was never retired," I said. "I told people I was because it was easier than explaining why I kept disappearing into meetings they weren't interested in hearing about." That landed. I watched it land, the slight tightening around his eyes, the recalibration happening behind them. He had accepted the retired bookkeeper story for years because I had offered it, and because nobody in this family had ever looked closely at the edges of it. That was not the same thing as deception. "What is Odom Capital Group?" he asked. "A private investment firm," I said, "structured as an LLC. Real estate acquisitions, development partnerships, secondary market positions across the Southeast. Mostly private partnerships, quiet structures. I reinvested most of what the company made back into the business itself." "Out of where?" "Prentice Ware's office suite on Tryon Street. She's been my attorney since the beginning. All business correspondence, filings, and meetings ran through her office." He stared at me. "We've been in this city the whole time." "Yes," I said. His eyes moved around the kitchen then. The same kitchen he had eaten in since childhood, the same house, the same cabinets, the same ordinary walls. I could see the confusion working through him now. Not just that I had built something, that I had built it without any visible change to the life he thought he understood. "You never lived like somebody running an investment firm." I almost smiled at that. "I lived like someone protecting a business," I said, "not advertising one. Most of the people you think are wealthy are performing wealth. Serious investors usually spend more time protecting capital than displaying it." He sat back slightly. "And Dad never knew?" "I think your father knew pieces." I paused. "He just never believed the pieces added up to anything important because they weren't happenings in rooms centered around him." The questions kept coming, and I kept answering them, directly, without softening, without the editorial layer I had spent 30 years applying to conversations in this family. Every answer was simply the truth. I had always been prepared to tell it. The preparation had just never been required before. I watched him absorb each answer and reach for the next question the way a person reaches for something to hold on to when the ground beneath them is rearranging. He had come here to collect information he could use to rebuild his understanding of me into something manageable. He was discovering that the information did not build in that direction. He went quiet for a moment. Then, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I looked at him. Not with anger. Not with the performed patience I had given him for decades. With something that was simply true and had been true for a long time. "You never asked, Deshaun. Not once in 34 years." The kitchen held that sentence for a long time. Neither of us moved to clear it. He left 20 minutes later with the careful movements of a man who no longer trusted the floor. I stood at the window and watched his car sit in the driveway for 2 full minutes before it pulled away. I learned the rest from Cortland that evening. Deshaun had called him from the car, told him what I said. Cortland had been quiet for a long time, the particular quiet of a man counting something he did not want to finish counting. Then he said, "She's right." Deshaun had no answer for that, neither did Cortland. Sylvette's house smelled like coffee and something baking, and 30 years of a woman living exactly as she pleased. I sat in her kitchen the way I only sat in one place in the world, without arrangement, without the careful posture I carried everywhere else. My shoes were off, My jacket was on the back of the chair. The cup she put in front of me was the chipped one she had owned since 1987 and refused to replace because it held the right amount. Sylvette had known me since before I knew myself. That was not sentiment. That was fact. She sat across from me and watched me for a moment, the way she always watched me when she was deciding whether to say the careful thing or the true one. Then she asked, "How are you holding up with all of this?" I gave her the answer I had been giving everyone. Measured, composed, fine, all things considered. Moving through it steadily, she let me finish. Then she set her cup down. "That's not what I asked you," she said. The kitchen went quiet, in the specific way. Sylvette's kitchen went quiet when she had decided the real conversation was starting whether I was ready or not. Outside, somewhere down the block, a lawnmower started and stopped again. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "All those years I came over, and you would disappear halfway through dinner because you had paperwork." A faint smile touched my mouth before I could stop it. "I did have paperwork. I know that now." She leaned back slightly. "Back then, I thought you were hiding from people." I looked down into my cup. The truth was, sometimes I had been. Not because I was ashamed of what I was building. Because I was tired of measuring how much of it a room could tolerate before somebody needed to make a joke or redirect the conversation somewhere more comfortable for them. Sylvette watched my face carefully. "You stopped offering pieces of yourself in that house a long time ago," she said quietly. There it was, not the dramatic version. Not the language people use when they want pain to sound poetic. Just the truth sitting plainly between two women, old enough to recognize it without decoration. I traced my thumb once along the rim of the cup. "In the beginning, I thought if I explained things better, they'd understand," I said. Then, after a while, I realized they weren't misunderstanding me. They just weren't listening very carefully. Sylvette nodded once, like that confirmed something she had suspected for years. "They performed certainty," she said after a moment. "Both of them, your husband and your son. Loud enough that eventually everybody else stopped checking whether they were actually right." I let out a quiet breath through my nose. Not quite a laugh. What she said wasn't cruel. That was the thing about Sylvette. She never sharpened a truth unnecessarily. If something cut coming from her, it was because the edge was already there before she touched it. She stood and refilled my cup without asking. Then she said, "Cortland came here." I looked up. "Last week. Sat right where you're sitting." She returned to the table slowly. He kept starting sentences he couldn't finish. Just starting them and stopping. I could picture it immediately. Cortland had always relied on fluency. Confidence came easily to men who spent years being treated like the natural authority in every room they entered. Losing that fluency would have felt like losing balance. Sylvette rested both hands around her own cup. At one point, he asked me if you ever seemed unhappy. A pause. I told him unhappy wasn't the right word. My fingers tightened once around the ceramic. "What word did you use?" She looked at me steadily, alone. The kitchen stayed quiet after that. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. I turned toward the window. The yard outside was very green and very still. Wind moved lightly through the trees at the back fence. Somewhere nearby, a screen door closed. "He sat here for almost 2 hours, Sylvette said softly. Then he stood up, thanked me for the coffee, and walked out without saying goodbye. I nodded once, because I understood exactly what that meant. A man does not forget goodbye after 32 years of manners. He forgets it when he leaves a room carrying something too heavy to hold and still remember ordinary things. He was at the kitchen table when I came downstairs at 6:45 in the morning. The coffee in front of him was full and cold. He had been there long enough for it to stop steaming and had not touched it, which told me everything about the state he was in before he opened his mouth. Cortland had been a coffee man for 32 years. He drank it the moment it was poured. A full cold cup meant he had been sitting in something too heavy to remember ordinary things. He looked up when I came in. His eyes were clear. He had not slept, but he had not been crying either. He had been thinking. The specific exhaustion of a man who had spent the night doing arithmetic he kept hoping would come out differently. "I need you to show me," he said. "Not show me everything, not I deserve to know, just show me." The way a man asks when he has already decided the answer will cost him something permanent, and has resolved to pay it anyway. I went to my office. I did not take long. The folders were where they always were. The filing cabinet beside my desk, third drawer, hanging files organized by year the way Prentice had taught me to organize them when we first started. I took out 3, the ones that told the clearest story in the least amount of pages. I placed them on the table in front of him, sat down across from him, said nothing. Before he opened the first one, I told him one thing. Odom Capital Group has always operated under a separate business address, Prentice Ware's office suite on Tryon Street. All statements, correspondence, and business tax filings went directly there. I filed business taxes separately from our household return every year. You signed the joint household return. You never asked what I filed independently. I paused. I never offered. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he opened the first folder. He went through them slowly. I did not watch his face, I watched his hands. The way they moved through the pages said more than his expression would have. Careful at first, the hands of a man still hoping for a misunderstanding. Then slower. Then very still on certain pages, the ones with the earliest dates. The ones from the years when Deshawn was still in school, and Cortland was telling people at dinner parties that he managed the household finances. The numbers were not what stopped his hands. The dates were 22 years of dates, moving across 3 folders in clean chronological order, each one representing a decision I had made alone at a desk in a room 20 feet from where he slept. He looked up at one point. His voice was even. Careful. I thought you were keeping books for other people. I was, I said, mine. He looked back down. Kept going. When he closed the last folder, he did not move for a long time. The kitchen was completely quiet. Outside, a car passed. A bird made one sound and stopped. Cortland sat with his hands flat on top of the closed folder, the way a man sits when he is trying to keep something from rising through him that he has no container for. I waited. He finally looked up. Did you ever want to tell me? I considered the question with the full weight it deserved, because it deserved weight. It was the most honest thing he had asked me in 32 years. I wanted you to want to know, I said. I picked up the folders, walked back to my office, closed the door behind me. Quietly, the way I had always done everything in this house. The 3 days after the folders were the quietest days this house had known in 32 years. Not the quiet of absence. Cortland was present, physically, in every room he had always occupied. He made his coffee in the morning. He sat in his chair in the evening. He moved through the house on its familiar routes. But the quality of his presence had changed in the way the quality of light changes before a storm. Same house, same rooms, same man, but something in the atmosphere altered at a level that had no name and required no announcement. I watched him the way I had learned to watch everything, without appearing to. On the second morning, he asked me something small. A financial question, property tax reassessment on the house, whether I thought the new valuation was accurate. He started the sentence, caught himself midway, and then finished it anyway. As though he had argued with himself about whether he still had the right to ask me things he had spent years assuming he already understood. I told him what I thought. He listened with both hands around his cup and his full attention on what I was saying, not waiting for his turn to redirect, not assembling his response while I was still speaking, just listening. It was the first time in 30 years that I had felt heard at this table. It was also the saddest thing I had witnessed in a long time. The third morning was worse. He came into the kitchen holding one of the folders, not open, just holding it. He stood there for a moment, like a man who had walked into the wrong room in his own house and didn't yet know how to recover naturally from it. I looked through them again last night, he said. I nodded once. His jaw moved slightly. I kept trying to remember where I was during some of those years. A short laugh escaped him, dry, humorless. Dinner parties, golf trips, sitting in restaurants, explaining markets to people. While you were already building positions, I couldn't have understood if you'd put them directly in front of me. That was the first defensive thing he had said since the folders. Not anger, not denial. Something smaller and sadder than that. A man trying to locate himself inside a history that no longer supported the version of himself he had relied on. I said nothing. He looked at the folder in his hands. Part of me keeps wanting to say you should have forced the conversation harder. He swallowed once after saying it, like he heard the weakness in it before I answered. And another part of me knows how unfair that sounds the moment it leaves my mouth. The honesty of that landed harder than a polished apology would have. You were very easy to defer to, I said quietly. You filled rooms naturally. People followed your confidence, because it arrived before anyone else's thoughts had a chance to. He lowered himself slowly into the chair across from me, tired, older than he had looked a week ago. And I let myself believe that meant I was seeing everything clearly. Yes, I said. He nodded once, accepted it, did not defend himself further. Later that afternoon, he called Deshawn. I was in my office with the door open, and I heard his side of it. The measured cadence of a man saying something he had decided could not wait and could not be softened. You owe your mother an apology, he said. Not a conversation, not an explanation. An apology. I heard Deshawn's voice rise on the other end, not the words, just the register. The familiar pitch of a man trying to argue his way back toward emotional footing. Cortland closed his eyes briefly before he answered. I'm not asking your opinion, he said. I'm telling you what's true. The call ended shortly after. That evening, he came to where I was sitting in the front room and stood in the doorway, the way men stand when they have something they need to say and are not certain they have earned the right to say it. How did I miss it, he asked. All of it. For all of those years. I looked at him. He was not defending himself. The question was genuine. The specific accounting of a man who had finally stopped protecting the version of himself he preferred over the truth of who he had been. I didn't lose you at the kitchen table, he said finally. It was not a question. No, I said. You didn't. Later that night, before we went upstairs, I told him I had spoken with Prentice Ware. He went still. He knew that name. He looked at me carefully and asked what for. I told him. Neither of us said the word. We did not need to. It was already in the room, quiet, settled, and not going anywhere. She rang the bell the same way Deshawn had. I noticed that immediately. The bell instead of a call ahead, the same careful signal of someone who was no longer certain of their standing at a door they had treated as a formality before. Imara stood on my porch in a plain coat with her hands at her sides and no performance in her face. No rehearsed opener, no social cushioning, just a woman who had decided to come and was here. I stepped back and let her in. We started with ordinary things, the way people who are building towards something difficult always start with ordinary things. She admired the front room, asked about a photograph on the side table. I made tea. We talked about small things for 10 minutes, and both of us understood that we were simply letting the room settle before we said anything that mattered. Then she set her cup down and looked at me directly. He told me you were difficult, she said, that you never supported him, that every time he tried to build something, you found a way to make it smaller. I considered that. Not the accusation. I had heard its variations for years. I considered the specific sadness of a woman who had accepted a portrait of someone without ever looking at the subject herself. I was always there, I said. He just didn't like what he saw when he looked. She held that, did not deflect it, did not defend him. She sat with it the way a person sits with something they already knew and were waiting to have confirmed. I've been watching you, she said, since the wedding, in every room. Waiting for the version of you Deshawn described to appear. She paused. There's only one version of you. There's only ever been one. That was accurate. I had never had the luxury of multiple versions. Precision had always been the only option available to me. She told me then what she had come to tell me. Her father had been in conversations with his fund managers for 3 weeks. Internal conversations, not preliminary, not exploratory, but structural. The Whitfield-Odom partnership was already being built at the framework level. My name had been in those discussions since before Reginald mentioned sending something to my office at the reception. The proposal I was expecting was not a beginning. It was a formality closing around a decision already made. I absorbed that without showing what it did to me. Imara knowing before I did. Reginald's own daughter carrying this to my door before his office sent the paperwork was not accidental. Reginald Whitfield did not do anything accidentally. She apologized then, not with preamble, not with qualifications built around her intentions or her circumstances. She said, at the dinner before the wedding, you started to answer a question, and I redirected the table. I knew what I was doing. I did it because it was easier than questioning what Deshawn had told me about you. A pause. That was wrong. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, I know you know that. I appreciate you saying it anyway. She nodded once, picked up her coat. I walked her to the door. We said quiet goodbyes, the genuine kind, not the performed kind. She stepped onto the porch and I began to close the door. She turned back. "He married you thinking your name meant nothing," she said. "My father built a career knowing it meant everything." She walked to her car. I stood in the open doorway and watched it until it turned the corner and disappeared. The street was very still after that. I stayed in the doorway longer than was necessary. Sylvette called me the following evening and told me everything. She had been at Amara's home, a prior arrangement, nothing connected to what was coming, when Deshawn arrived. She said she offered to leave. Amara told her to stay. That detail alone told me everything I needed to know about where Amara had arrived internally. A woman who asks a witness to remain is a woman who has already made her decision and wants to see whether the other person is willing to tell the truth with someone else in the room. Deshawn came in with the energy he always carried when he was managing something. Shoulders set, voice calibrated, the specific momentum of a man who had already decided how the conversation would go. He found Amara in the front room, composed, seated, still in the way that still people are still when they have finished moving in a direction and are not starting another one yet. He started talking before he sat down. Sylvette said he went through carefully. His mother's sudden visibility was changing the dynamics around the family. Reginald's interest was creating assumptions. People were beginning to blur personal relationships with business judgment. He framed everything as concern, practical concern, the kind respectable people hide behind when they want control without appearing controlling. He said he had reached out to one of Reginald's senior assistants earlier that week. Not to interfere, that was how he phrased it. To advise caution. To suggest that family relationships sometimes complicated business structures in ways outsiders couldn't immediately see. That landed more realistically, not sabotage, management. That had always been Deshawn's instinct. Amara let him finish completely. Then she said, "You called my father's office." Deshawn went quiet. "You contacted his staff before speaking to me." Her voice stayed calm. "Before speaking to your mother. Before speaking to my father directly." Sylvette said the silence that followed had a specific texture. The silence of a man realizing a conversation he believed sounded reasonable in his own head no longer sounded reasonable once spoken aloud in front of someone else. Deshawn recalibrated quickly. He said he was protecting the family structure. Said his father-in-law didn't understand the emotional history involved. Said outside people were beginning to romanticize his mother's business reputation without understanding the reality of what their family relationships had actually looked like for years. Amara did not argue with any of it. That was what unsettled him. She simply stayed where she already was emotionally while he kept moving around the room, trying to find stable ground. Finally, she said, very quietly, "Do you hear yourself?" Sylvette told me Deshawn stopped speaking after that. Not because he agreed. Because for the first time since the wedding, somebody was listening to the shape of what he was saying instead of the polish he used to deliver it. Amara folded her hands once in her lap before she spoke again. "My father has spent 40 years building partnerships with people who know how to separate ego from judgment," she said. "You really thought a phone call from a son-in-law was going to protect him from being manipulated?" Deshawn said he wasn't questioning Reginald's intelligence. Amara held his eyes. "But you were questioning your mother's integrity." That landed harder because it was true. Sylvette said Deshawn tried one more time after that, softer this time, less certain. He said everything around Verlaine suddenly felt strategic. The timing, the visibility, the way people were reacting to information none of them had known before. Amara listened without interrupting. Then she said something that ended the conversation. "I never actually looked at your mother," she said. "I just accepted the version of her that made you comfortable." She let that sit between them. "And now that I've looked for myself, I don't recognize the woman you described at all." Sylvette said. Deshawn opened his mouth, closed it again. Every version of this conversation he had prepared for required Amara to push emotionally so he could redirect the emotion into management. She never did. She stayed calm enough that all his explanations lost their camouflage. There was nothing left to organize after that. Only himself. He looked away first. Amara called her father later that night. Sylvette didn't hear that conversation. She didn't need to. The next morning, Reginald called me directly. His voice was warm in the specific way of a man whose judgment had just settled firmly into place. "Expect the proposal by end of week," he said. I thanked him. "No," he said simply. "Thank you." The envelope arrived on a Wednesday morning by courier, not email, not a digital signature request. A physical envelope, cream-colored, the kind that announces its contents before you open it. The kind that says whatever is inside was considered important enough to send by hand. It sat on my kitchen table for 4 minutes before I opened it. Not because I was uncertain. Because I understood that some things deserve the weight of a moment before you let them change the room. The document inside was 11 pages, clean formatting, precise language. The kind of drafting that comes from attorneys who understand that every word in a structure like this is load-bearing. I read it from the first line to the last, without stopping. Whitfield Odom Southeast Development Fund, my name, not a silent position. Not background capital hidden 3 layers deep in an operating structure. A named partnership, Odom Capital Group, listed alongside Whitfield Equity Partners in the structure header, in the fund title, on every page where the principals were referenced. 22 years of work that had moved mostly through private partnerships and closed rooms without my name attached to it, now attached. Publicly, irrevocably, I sat with that for a moment. Then I called Prentice. We spoke for 40 minutes. I asked her 2 questions, one about the liability structure on the named partnership position, one about the exit provisions if the fund's direction shifted beyond agreed parameters. She answered both completely. When she finished, I told her I would respond by Friday. She said she would be ready. I set the phone down and looked at the document on my table. Word reached Deshawn by Thursday afternoon. I knew it would. The professional community in Charlotte moved information quietly but efficiently, especially when Whitfield Equity Partners attached its name to something new. He called at 4:17. I watched his name on the screen for 2 full rings before I answered. The first thing I noticed was the silence before he spoke. He was searching for the register. The pitch and tone that fit a call he had no template for. Every previous call he had made to me in his adult life had a shape he already knew when he dialed. This one had no shape. I let him find it on his own. "I heard about the fund," he said finally. "Your name is on it." "It is," I said. Another pause. Longer this time. I didn't realize it had gotten that serious. There it was. Not denial exactly. Something more reflexive than that. The final instinct of a man trying to place a ceiling back onto something that had already grown beyond him. "It was serious before you knew about it," I said gently. Silence again. "Then, have you decided?" "Not yet." He asked if he could come. I said yes. He arrived within the hour. Sat across from me at the table where the documents still lay, not closed, not put away. Present. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at me. Not at the story he had carried about me for 34 years. At me. The specific quality of his attention had changed in the way attention changes when a person finally stops filtering what they are seeing through what they expected to see. "What do you want?" he asked. Not what Reginald was offering, not what the structure required. "What do you actually want?" I looked at my son and understood that this was the first honest question he had ever asked me, without trying to guide the answer somewhere useful to himself afterward. So I answered honestly. What I wanted was what I had always been building toward, to have my work stand in public the way it had always stood in private. To stop being the best-kept professional secret in rooms that had known the deals for years, but never the person behind them. He nodded slowly. Twice I watched him almost interrupt. The old reflex was still there, the instinct to explain, reinterpret, soften himself back into the center of conversation. But each time, he stopped himself before the words fully arrived. That mattered to me. Not because restraint erased what came before it. Because real change usually announces itself quietly first. We sat together for another hour. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. Deshawn was still carrying too much ego for either of those things to happen cleanly yet, and I was too clear-eyed now to mistake a beginning for a conclusion. But it was real. 2 people having the first honest conversation they had ever managed without trying to win it. On Friday morning, I signed the proposal, sent it back to Prentice's office by 9. Then I called Sylvette. "It's done now," I said. She exhaled. Long, slow, the breath of a woman who had been holding something on behalf of someone she loved for a very long time. Neither of us said anything else. neither of us needed to. There is a particular kind of quiet that lives on the other side of a decision fully made. Not the quiet of avoidance. Not the quiet of someone waiting to be talked out of something. The quiet of a woman who had sat with every version of a choice, turned it over completely, and set it down facing the direction it needed to face. That was the quiet I carried into the proceedings. It did not waver. It did not require maintenance. It was simply there, the way foundations are there, underneath everything, whether or not anyone thinks to look. The truth was, the marriage had been ending for much longer than either of us had said aloud. The wedding had not destroyed it. The wedding had simply removed the last excuse for pretending I could still live comfortably inside a version of myself built around being unseen. Prentice filed the initial paperwork on a Tuesday. The asset disclosure was required by law, and I had prepared it with the same precisions I brought to every document that passed through my professional life. Every holding listed, every return recorded, every year accounted for. Going back to the first Odom Capital transaction 22 years ago, a secondary market position on a mixed-use parcel in Mecklenburg County that had returned 4 times its entry value inside 30 months. All of it, clean, chronological, unambiguous. The full picture of what I had built, attached to a marriage being formally concluded. Cortland's attorney called Prentice's office 3 times in 1 week. Prentice told me about the calls without editorializing. That was her way, had always been her way. The calls were not contests, they were not accusations. They were the calls of a man trying to understand what he was reading because the structure of our life together suddenly looked different in retrospect than it had while he was standing inside it. Each call asked a clarifying question. Each question revealed another layer of what had existed inside this marriage without being seen. Prentice answered everything accurately. That was all that was required. Cortland requested a final conversation before the proceedings advanced. I agreed. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had held the folders, the cold coffee, the unspoken word, and he did not ask me to stop. He had enough self-knowledge left to understand that asking me to stop was not a conversation he had earned. He told me he was sorry, not for the wedding, not for the folders, not for the visible moments that had finally forced everything into the open. He was sorry for the years before all of it, for the redirections, for the casual authority he had worn so naturally he had mistaken it for normal, for building his understanding of our marriage around an assumption I had quietly carried for decades, because correcting it every day would have required becoming someone exhausted all the time. It was the most precise apology I had ever received. I thanked him directly, without the softening I would have applied to those words 10 years ago. Then I told him it changed nothing about my decision. He nodded. Not the nod of a man accepting defeat, the nod of a man accepting truth. There was a difference and he had finally learned it. We sat together for a few more minutes without speaking. 2 people at the end of something that had been long and real and had slowly become unsustainable in ways neither of us had fully named when they were happening. I did not rush it. Some endings deserved to be sat with, not managed away. Then I stood, walked him to the door. We said goodbye the way people say goodbye when they mean it and know it is final, simply, without theater. I closed the door, walked back through the house alone, past the kitchen, past the front room, past the office where the 3 folders still sat in their drawer, exactly where I had returned them. I did not stop. I kept walking until I reached the window at the end of the hall, stood there and looked out at the street. The same neighborhood, the same quiet that had surrounded this house for 22 years while everything inside it shifted without anyone outside knowing. Friday was 4 days away. I thought about what it held, and I felt something move through me that I had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness. Happiness was too light for what this was. Something underneath happiness. Something that did not depend on circumstances or other people's recognition to sustain itself. Something that had been there the whole time, waiting for the house around it to finally get quiet enough to hear. My name was on the materials at the door, not buried in the fine print, not listed as a silent contributor in an appendix nobody reads. On the materials at the door, the program handed to every person who walked into that room, the banner behind the podium, the fund title on every surface that carried a title, Whitfield Odom Southeast Development Fund. My name joined to work that had always been mine, finally standing in public the way it had always stood in private. I arrived early, not from anxiety, from habit. I had always done my best thinking in rooms before they filled. I stood near the window with coffee I actually drank this time and watched the space come alive around me. Caterers, event staff, Reginald's team arranging materials with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the details of a room announced its intentions before anyone spoke. One of the event coordinators handed me a program and moved on without a second glance. I looked at my name on it for exactly 1 moment. Then I folded it and put it in my bag. I did not need to hold it to know it was real. The guests arrived the way guests always arrived at events like this. In clusters, in conversation, in the specific social geometry of people who already knew each other and were here to make that knowing official in a new context. Within 30 minutes, I had been approached by people from 4 different firms. Some I recognized from Reginald's earlier gathering. Some were new. None of them approached me with surprise anymore. That was the difference. The recognition had settled. A woman from Atlanta asked whether I still believed secondary corridor redevelopment was being undervalued in the Carolinas. A developer from Nashville referenced a position I had taken years ago that his partners initially thought was too aggressive until the returns forced them, though, to reconsider. Another man simply shook my hand and said, "I've been hearing your name for years." Not admiration, acceptance. The room had already made space for me before I entered it. I received each conversation the way I had learned to receive accurate things, directly, without deflecting, without performing modesty I did not feel. Reginald found me near the center of the room when the formal program began. He introduced me to the assembled guests the way a man introduces someone whose work has earned every word he is about to say, by name, by history, by the specific decisions that had shaped the landscape everyone in that room operated inside. Not as someone's mother, not as anyone's wife, as Verlaine Odom, as Odom Capital Group, as the woman who had seen what other people missed and moved before the window closed. It was the introduction I had been owed for 22 years. And for one brief moment, one small private moment, I felt it, not triumph. Something deeper and far more human than that. Relief. The exhaustion of carrying something valuable alone, for so long finally loosening its grip by a single degree. I let myself feel it exactly once, then it passed. I stood straight with both feet on the ground and received the room without performance. I found Deshaun with my eyes before he found me with his. He was near the far edge of the room, present but peripheral, the body language of a man still learning how to exist inside a room that no longer revolved naturally around him. Amara was 30 feet away in a separate conversation, her posture open and engaged, already moving through this room on her own terms. She had not come as anyone's wife tonight. She had come as herself. Deshaun watched me receive what he had spent years deciding I had not earned. I did not look away. Neither did he. And for the first time since the wedding, I saw something in his face that had nothing to do with confusion or defensiveness or recalculation. Grief, not for the fun, for the years. For the version of me he had accepted because it required less from him than seeing me clearly would have. What passed between us across that room was not forgiveness. Forgiveness would come later, slowly, in ordinary moments, if it came at all. It was not war either. It was something quieter and more permanent than either. It was 2 people finally seeing each other accurately. I turned back toward the room, toward the work, toward the name on the banner behind the podium, toward the version of myself I had built across 22 years of early mornings and closed doors, and the specific discipline of a woman who understood that the work was always worth more than the argument about the work. I was not performing power. I was simply no longer hiding from it. They introduced me as the failure. He already knew me as the foundation.